You are staring at that glowing screen, aren't you? Sitting in that agonizing, heavy silence, wondering why a man who pursued you so fiercely has suddenly evaporated into thin air. That profound ache of abandonment, of being quietly discarded, can make you feel entirely invisible. Society has relentlessly conditioned you to believe that being a good, empathetic woman means endlessly absorbing this disrespect, patiently operating as an unpaid, round-the-clock rehabilitation center for men who treat emotional consistency as a rather tedious inconvenience. But here is the brilliant, incredibly counterintuitive truth of human psychology. Trying to eloquently explain your pain to a toxic man is precisely what keeps you trapped in his web. In the twisted economy of a manipulator, utterly ignoring him is quite literally the only way to finally be heard. What if I told you that your deep empathy is not a fatal flaw, but the most lethal weapon in your arsenal? What if you used that exact same razor-sharp intuition not to heal his pathetic wounds, but to surgically read his deepest insecurities and systematically deconstruct his fragile ego? In this video, I am going to give you the exact psychological blueprint to completely dismantle his games and reclaim your unshakable peace. You are about to become a woman his ego simply cannot survive. Welcome, darling, to the era of the dark empath. You've likely been told your entire life that your deep, nurturing empathy is a rare and beautiful gift, and whilst it certainly is, in the ruthless economy of modern dating, it also serves as a flashing neon sign for manipulative men. These emotional vampires do not stumble into your life by chance. They actively hunt for the nice girl to slowly drain her life force. They see your boundless compassion not as something to cherish, but rather a very convenient all-you-can-eat buffet for their incredibly fragile egos. Let us be brutally honest for a moment. You have been operating as an unpaid rehabilitation center for broken men, haven't you? You sit there, analyzing his erratic behavior, making endless excuses for his silence, and desperately trying to heal wounds you never even caused. I completely understand the innate urge to fix him, but darling, he doesn't want to be fixed. He wants to be accommodated. Your relentless understanding is the exact currency he uses to fund his toxic behavior. The absolute first step for a high-value woman is the swift and merciless execution of her inner therapist. It is officially time to hand in your resignation. When he cancels plans on a Friday evening with a vague, pathetic excuse, you do not write a sprawling paragraph deciphering his childhood fear of intimacy. Instead, you put your phone on Do Not Disturb, pour yourself a rather generous glass of Malbec, and get delightfully lost in a brilliant book. You must entirely stop doing his emotional heavy lifting. By immediately cutting off his emotional supply, you starve the very dynamic that keeps him in a position of power. Manipulators absolutely thrive on your chaotic reactions, your tears, and your desperate, exhausting attempts to communicate. When you suddenly withdraw that warm, soothing energy, he is left completely unmoored and bewildered. It is a profound shock to his psychological system when the woman he thought he had completely figured out suddenly turns off the tap of endless affection. But simply cutting off the supply is only the first phase of your metamorphosis. Once you have firmly stopped healing him, you must learn exactly what to do with the cold, hard reality of his actions. You see, when a man is utterly inconsistent and playing games, the most devastating response isn't anger, drama, or tears, but rather a strategic reflection so chillingly accurate it leaves his ego entirely exposed. You have successfully retired from your unpaid role as his therapist. Now we deploy a far more sophisticated strategy, the ice mirror. A manipulator fully expects you to overcompensate the moment he pulls away. When he goes cold, your natural empathetic instinct has always been to burn brighter just to keep him warm. But what if you simply reflected his exact temperature? If he becomes distant and inconsistent, you do not chase, you become an absolute iceberg. It is a ruthless psychological tactic that completely short-circuits his entire power dynamic. Let us look at a rather tedious yet familiar scenario. He vanishes for 12 hours, eventually surfacing with a lackluster, "Hey, been busy." The old you might have rushed to reply, perhaps asking if he was quite all right. The sovereign woman, however, mirrors him flawlessly. You leave his message untouched until the next day, and when you finally reply, it is a devastatingly breezy, "No worries at all, had a brilliant time out." You do not demand an explanation, you simply match his pathetic lack of effort with absolute terrifying indifference. Because of your deep empathy, your intuition remains razor-sharp. You can read his insecurities, his deep-seated fears, and his rather obvious need to be chased, almost as easily as reading the morning paper. You know precisely why he plays these exhausting little games. But here is the masterful twist of the dark empath. You observe these glaring flaws, you understand them completely, yet you do not lift a single perfectly manicured finger to soothe them. You let him sit in the uncomfortable mess of his own making, utterly denying him the comfort of your emotional labor. This approach is particularly devastating to him because a toxic man's ego relies entirely upon your predictability. He expects you to be his reliable emotional anchor, whilst he gets to play the turbulent storm. By becoming the ice mirror, you strip away the one thing he craves most: control. He looks at you expecting to see a reflection of his own power and importance, but instead he meets a chilling, impenetrable wall of ice. His ego, so accustomed to basking in your warm validation, suddenly finds itself freezing in the dark. Naturally, this sudden drop in temperature will send him into a quiet panic, and he will inevitably try to claw back that lost control. When his silence fails to break you, he will pivot, fishing for reassurance, a compliment, or even an argument, absolutely anything to prove he still has a grip on your emotional state. He is, at his core, an addict desperately searching for his next hit of applause. But the truly dangerous woman anticipates this performance, knowing there is a very precise critical moment to pull the rug completely out from under him. At the very core of every manipulator's psyche lies a rather desperate, insatiable addiction. He is not actually seeking an equal partner. He is seeking a captive audience, someone to provide a constant standing ovation for his profoundly mediocre performance. He thrives on feeling incredibly important, pulling your emotional strings just to watch you dance to his erratic tune. As a sovereign woman, you must realize that your undivided attention is the drug he simply cannot live without. And just like any seasoned dealer, you hold the ultimate power to cut off his supply without a moment's notice. The tactic of interrupted validation is an absolute masterpiece of psychological warfare. You see, a toxic man will occasionally throw you a breadcrumb, a sudden charming text, a grand gesture out of nowhere, or a rather boastful story about his day, entirely expecting you to swoon and stroke his incredibly fragile ego. This is the exact moment he anticipates you falling back into your old compliant role, showering him with the reassurance he so desperately craves. He expects an immediate glowing reward for his absolute bare minimum effort. Instead of rewarding him, you execute a brilliant, calculated withdrawal. Imagine he sends you an overly confident photograph of himself or drops an arrogant boast about his career, fully expecting you to respond with effusive praise. Rather than sending a predictable flurry of emojis, you reply hours later with a spectacularly neutral, "That's nice," or even better, you completely change the subject to something utterly mundane, like a fascinating documentary you just watched on Roman architecture. You deny him the applause exactly when he is standing center stage waiting for it. This sudden, unexpected denial of validation triggers a severe ego withdrawal. It is genuinely fascinating to observe. The manipulator's brain completely short-circuits because the predictable cause and effect he relies upon has been entirely dismantled. He is left desperately grasping at thin air, his inflated sense of self suddenly deflating like a remarkably sad balloon. You are subtly communicating that your world does not revolve around his achievements or his manufactured charm, and quite frankly, you have far more interesting things to occupy your brilliant mind. Stripped of his applause and left utterly bewildered by your absolute composure, he will likely attempt one final desperate performance to provoke a reaction. He wants you to explode, to argue, or to frantically try and expose his toxic game so he can comfortably label you the crazy, obsessed ex. It is incredibly tempting to deliver a fiery monologue that finally puts him in his place, but giving him that chaotic confrontation is exactly the lifeline his ego needs to survive. The truly fatal blow, the absolute masterstroke that will completely destroy his narrative, requires a totally different, deafeningly quiet approach. It is an incredibly common, almost tragic flaw in human nature to desperately want the final word. When you finally see the manipulator for exactly what he is, your immediate instinct is to draft a furiously eloquent 6-page WhatsApp essay detailing every single one of his toxic transgressions. You want to expose him, to force him to look in the mirror and finally admit that he has been a rather dreadful partner. But darling, sending that dramatic, emotionally charged final message is the absolute worst strategic mistake you could possibly make. It merely proves to him that he still holds the power to completely destabilize your emotional state. A toxic man's ego is a remarkably stubborn beast. It simply cannot be defeated by logic, tears, or a fiery confrontation. If you stand there and scream at him, you are inadvertently handing him the exact ammunition he needs to call you hysterical to all his friends down at the pub. He will inevitably twist your totally justified anger into a highly convenient narrative where he is the unfortunate, quiet victim of your unreasonable demands. The sovereign woman understands that arguing with a manipulator is rather like playing chess with a pigeon. It will simply knock over the pieces, soil the board, and strut around as if it has achieved a grand victory. Therefore, the true, most intensely painful punishment you can possibly inflict upon his incredibly fragile ego is a completely silent discard. You do not block him with a grand, dramatic announcement. You simply vanish, evaporating from his daily life as if his presence never truly mattered at all. When he sends that inevitable, pathetic late-night text a few weeks later, you do not leave him on read to prove a point. You genuinely don't even open the message because you are far too busy living a remarkably peaceful life. Absolute stone-cold silence is the one response he simply cannot manipulate, twist, or argue against. This profound, unshakable silence is devastating because it signals a reality that a narcissist cannot possibly comprehend: utter irrelevance. By walking away without a single backwards glance, you are silently communicating that his entire performance was simply too boring to watch until the final act. You actively deny him the closure or the dramatic exit he thinks he deserves, leaving him trapped in a perpetual, agonizing state of confusion. He fully expects you to be shattered, but instead you are simply walking out of the theater completely unfazed to grab a rather lovely flat white and move on with your splendid day. Achieving this unshakable peace after walking away is the ultimate hallmark of the dark empath. You have successfully weaponized your intuition, reading his deepest flaws, not to heal his brokenness, but to completely dismantle his pathetic hold over your brilliant life. You are no longer the naive victim caught in his chaotic web. You have reclaimed your absolute power, remaining completely untouchable and utterly serene in your silence. But mastering this silent triumph and ensuring his ego remains permanently shattered leads us to one final essential reflection. Before we part ways, I have a rather provocative question for you, and I expect you to be brutally honest. How many months, or perhaps even years, have you wasted pouring your brilliant golden empathy into a manipulator who gave you absolutely nothing but anxiety in return? I want you to confess it in the comments below. Let that comment section serve as a permanent graveyard for the men who simply could not afford your healing. If you are quite finished playing the accommodating good girl and are finally ready to master the dark, elegant psychology of high-value relationships, it is time to claim your power. Subscribe to Destiny's Decree right now and ensure those notifications are firmly turned on. Do not let another mediocre man play with your unshakable peace, darling. I shall see you in the next session.